Now, there's a common theme that flows through all our scriptural readings from this morning, and it can be summed up in one word: consequences. We see how most of the situations, consequences are negative, but there are occasions, odd occasions, when they are positive as well. The area where consequence plays a dominant role in our readings is really, firstly, the difference between Israel's first and second attempts at conquering Ai. The first attempt had negative results, and the second attempt had positive results. Further, following that, we will consider the actions of Lot and his family during the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, which also resulted in negative consequences. But the contrast, we see a totally positive outcome because of Abraham's willingness to offer up Yitzhak before Yahweh. Then finally, we'll look at two examples in the book of Acts. Hananiah and his wife, whose lives were taken because they lied about the property they'd sold, and the negative consequences of that. Conversely, the positive consequences of what Shaul did or received from Yahweh, Yahshua. So let's start with Yahshua chapters 7 and 8. These two chapters reveal very strong lessons about consequences, particularly when the people acted willfully against the covenant of Yahweh. Beginning in chapter 7, verse 1, we see how the actions of one man misappropriating the goods that had been set aside to be destroyed brought consequences and the anger of Yahweh to blaze against the people of Israel. The same verse also nominates one individual, Achan, from the tribe of Yehudah, as being responsible for that misappropriation. But his actions had profound consequences on the whole community. His contemptuous attitude later resulted in the death of 36 men from Israel when they attacked Ai. There was also another consequence that contributed towards the loss of those 36 men, and that was the complacency expressed by the men who reconnoitered Ai before they went to attack. And in verse 3, Yahshua said, they said to Yahshua, "Don't have all the people go up. Let's just perhaps have 2,000 or 3,000 men go up and attack Ai. There is no point in making all the people exert themselves to get there, because there are only a few of them." Two very bad mistakes had been made. Firstly, the misappropriation of the goods from Jericho, and later, of course, the overconfidence in their own ability to overthrow Ai. The consequence from both actions brought about the anger of Yahweh. That shows the action of one person or a few people can bring great reproach on the whole community. Then in verses 6 through 9, we see how Yahshua reacted to the outcome. He falls on his face, along with the leaders of Israel, pleading to Yahweh for an answer to the things that were going so horribly wrong. In a moment of doubt, Yahshua says to Yahweh, "Why did you take the trouble to bring our people across the Jordan if you meant to hand us over to the Amori and have us perish? We should have been satisfied to live on the other side of the Jordan." Again, in verse 9, his despair becomes even more apparent as he continues. "For when the Canaani and other peoples living in the land hear about it, they will surround us and wipe us off the face of the earth. What will you do then to save the honor of your great name?" However, things changed for the better in verses 10 through 12. When Yahweh rebukes Yahshua, saying, "Stand up! Why are you lying face down on the ground?" Yahweh then revealed why the things had gone so horribly wrong in verses 11 and 12. It was all the result of the sinful actions of Israel. The consequences of Achan having stolen what had been set aside for destruction. Yahweh then explained that the people of Israel could not stand against their enemies because they were under a curse. They had to be cleansed and consecrated before that curse could be removed. Yahweh then concluded by saying, I won't be with you anymore unless you destroy the things meant for destruction that you have with you. Beginning in verse 13, Yahweh then tells Yahshua how Israel can set themselves right with him yet again. But rather than singling out Achan by name, Yahweh demands that all Israel face the consequences of the actions of that one man. They all need to be shown that individual transgressing against the commands of Yahweh impacts upon the whole community. Yahweh instructs Yahshua to have each tribe pass past him individually and stand up. They had to stand up in front of Yahshua and state their guilt or innocence before Yahweh. In that way, all Israel learned the severity of violating the covenants of Yahweh. Then in verse 15, Yahweh tells Yahshua the penalty that will be imposed on the guilty person when he says, the person who's caught with these things in his possession were to be reserved for destruction is to be burnt to ashes. He and everything he has, because he has violated the covenant of Yahweh and has committed a shameful deed in Israel. This is a very extreme sentence to be imposed upon a guilty party. But it also needed to ensure that all Israel knew that at all times they could not hold in contempt the commands of Yahweh, or they would face drastic consequences. The next day, Yahshua got up early and took the tribe of Yehudah to appear before him. It doesn't say whether the other 11 tribes also fronted up, but the search slowly whittled it down from tribe through the family right down to Achan himself. Realizing that Achan was the guilty man, Yahshua says to him in verse 19, my son, swear to Yahweh, the God of Israel, that you will tell the truth and confess to him. Tell me now, what did you do? Don't hide anything from me. Achan confesses his guilt and reveals that the goods were stored, where the goods were stored. Then the messengers brought the stolen items and placed them before Yahweh. The chapter ends with the whole saga being brought to a finality in verses 25 and 26, where Achan is stoned by the people, all the people of Israel, and then burned to ashes along with all that he had stolen. Finally, his ashes, along with the goods, were buried under a pile of stones as a constant reminder to all the people of Israel that someone who knowingly holds in contempt the covenants of Yahweh will be destroyed. And that brings us to chapter 8. Having established why the 36 men had died at the hands of the enemy, Yahshua then returns with the idea of the ambush of the city of Ai. As Yahweh says, don't be afraid or fall into despair. Take all the people who can fight with you and send them out and go up against Ai. Because now I have handed over the king of Ai and his people and his city and his land to you. This was a total reversal of what had happened the first time they attacked Ai. Now Yahweh is working for them because the curse had been lifted. Then in verse 2, Yahweh says, "Do to Ai and its king as to what I did to Jericho and the king. But this time, take its spoils, the cattle as booty for yourselves." This is the exact opposite instruction from what Yahweh had given before the conquest of Jericho. Remember back last week, Yahshua was told in chapter 6, verse 18 and 19, Yahweh told Yahshua, before ye march to the city of Jericho, keep clear of everything reserved for destruction. If you bring a curse on yourselves by taking anything aside to be destroyed, you will bring a curse on the whole camp of Israel and cause great distress there. All the silver and gold and all the brass and iron utensils are to be separated out for Yahweh to add to the treasury of Yahweh. Now this time, with the city of Ai, Yahweh is telling them that they are to take those spoils with the cattle as their booty. What seems to be here is a scriptural paradox. So what exactly is a paradox? The dictionary defines it as something seemingly absurd or a contradictory statement or proposition, which, when investigated, may prove well-founded and true. So the difference we're seeing here between what Israel were told before they went to for the conquest of Jericho and now the attack of Ai is all to do with the certain circumstances and the actions that were taken. At the conquest of Jericho, all Israel had to do was just march around the walls 6 days, and on the 7th day, 7 times around. They had to blow the shofars and shout out at the time the shofars were being sounded. Then the walls came down so that they could enter the city and destroy it. But it was Yahweh who caused the walls to collapse. Therefore, Israel had no entitlement to the spoils of that effort. It was all Yahweh's doing. By contrast, they are now being called upon to take direct action against the people of Ai. Hence, Yahweh has told them that they are entitled to the spoils this time because of their efforts in the war. That is the paradox. In both situations, Yahweh commanded regarding the spoils is to be found to be both true and worthy. Yahweh alone received the spoils at Jericho, while Israel received the spoils at Ai. So what about the ambush at Ai? In verse 2, that verse concludes with the words, ambush the city from behind. Then in verses 3 through 8, Yahshua, having regained his confidence and the ability to lead Israel into battle against their enemies, he instructs the people, all the fighting men available, to advance against Ai. This time, they apply the technique of ambush that will draw the fighting men of Ai out while Israel stages another mock retreat. And it'll draw the people of Ai out of the city, just the way they had done the first time. The men of Ai would be tricked into thinking that Israel again was retreating because they had been overpowered by the people. But the ambush party from behind the city were ready to enter and destroy everything. They enter, setting fire to the houses and barns, while at the same time, of course, taking the spoil as their booty. As the latter part of verse 7 says, Yahweh your God will hand it over to you. Those were the words of support Yahshua gave to the men before they advanced. So what follows in verses 9 through 13 set out Yahshua's attack plan. He proposed that the main body of the people of Israel would be in front of Ai overnight, and a small group would be ready to storm Ai and pursue. Once the men of Ai had pursued the receding party from the gates. Verse 13 describes the scene, saying, "Thus the people arrayed themselves with the army to the north of the city, and their rear guard waiting in the west of the city. Yahshua spent the night in the valley." Then in verses 14 through 17, it records how the king of Ai fell for the plan and pursued the men of Israel out to the Arava, the plains of the Yarden, believing that Israel was again facing defeat and retreating. They were so confident that their pursuit, in verse 17 says, "Not one man was left in Ai or Beit El who had not gone out after Israel. They left the city wide open." Once the fighting men had departed from the city, Yahweh told Yahshua, "Point your spear towards Ai." In verse 26, Yahshua did not withdraw his hand, which he had used to point the spear, until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. Now that is very similar to how Moshe held up his arms at the same time while this same man, Yahshua, was battling with the Amalekites on their way to Mount Horeb in Shemot, Exodus chapter 17. Now the ambush party rushed into the city and set fire to everything, just as Yahweh had ordered. Then in verse 20, while the men of Ai looked behind and saw it, they saw smoke from the city rising to the sky. They had no power to flee this way or that, at which point the people of Israel, who had run off toward the desert, turned round and turned back on their pursuers. Israel killed all apart from the king of Ai, whom they took alive directly to Yahshua. In verse 29, the king of Ai, he hanged on a tree until evening. At sundown, Yahshua gave the order that they are to take down his carcass from the tree and throw it into the entrance of the city and pile big stones over it, where it stands to this day. So having completed the task and having taken the spoils of war that Yahweh had given, then Yahshua turned Ai into a tell, a mound of ruins forever. The consequences of Israel's following all the instructions of their leader, as given by Yahweh, ultimately turned into positive consequences, positive outcomes. The next one is Mount Gerazine and Mount Eval. The remainder of chapter 8 focuses on Yahshua building an altar to Yahweh in the plains in front of those two mountains. It was erected in accordance with the instructions that had been given to Moshe. After the altar was built completely of natural stone. None of it had been touched with iron working tools. It was a rustic structure that Yahweh wanted, not a polished, perfectly formed stone structure that was so common among the nations who went to great lengths to embellish their altars for their gods. Yahweh wanted it in its natural form. Having completed the altar, the Kohanim then raised burnt and peace offerings in accordance with the Torah of Moshe. Next, Yahshua erected two large stones and wrote a copy of the whole Torah upon them. All of this was done just as Moshe had instructed in Devarim chapter 27, verses 2 through 6. And then in verses 7 and 8, he also said, "You are to sacrifice peace offerings, to eat there, and be joyful in the presence of Yahweh your God. You are to write on the stones all the words of the Torah very clearly. Now Yahshua did all that in the presence of Israel. Then, in chapter 8, verses 33, all Israel, including the leaders, the officials, and the judges, stood either side of the ark for the covenant. Half the people in front of Mount Gerazine, half in front of Mount Eval, just as Moshe the servant had ordered it to be done. So chapter 8 concludes with Yahshua reading all the words of the Torah, including the blessing and the curse. He read in the presence of Israel, who assembled in front of the mountains, as Yahweh had earlier instructed Moshe. Again, the outcome of doing what Moshe had earlier instructed led again to a positive consequence for Israel. What about the consequences we read about in today's parasha? In Vayera, we read how Avraham negotiated with Yahweh over the plight that was about to befall Sodom and Gomorrah. It is significant that both cities were in close proximity to the place where Jericho stood. It is significant that both cities, they were most likely inhabited also by the Amori, the ones whom Yahweh said to Abraham would be ripe for punishment by the time Abraham's descendants, led by Yahshua, returned to the land. So we see the correlation between the two. It's quite close. The exchange Abraham had with Yahweh over how many righteous people needed to be in the city before he would forgive it and prevent the destruction. It doesn't say, but Abraham was doubtless appealing on behalf of Lot and his family. He starts off with 50 people, and then Abraham begins bargaining downwards until he gets to 10 people. And Yahweh says, for the sake of 10 people, I will not destroy it. There may well have been 10 people in Lot's family living in or near Sodom. But at the end, only Lot and his wife and the 2 virgin daughters were prepared to heed the warning that the angels gave. They were the only ones who were prepared to flee from the pending destruction. Even Lot's wife, having such a strong desire to return to her place of dwelling, turns around and instantly turns to a pillar of salt. That was a dire consequence of her lack of obedience to the instruction from the angels, do not look back. Then later, Lot was tricked into having sex with his 2 daughters, and he fathered 2 nations, whom Yahweh detested. Again, there was a lack of trust in Yahweh that he would remove the isolation. So they took the matter into their own hands, and for the rest of the history, those 2 nations have been at odds with Israel. In spite of the blood relationship between Israel and Ammon and Moab, they never found favor. Those 2 nations never found favor with Yahweh. They were another example of negative consequences. Taking plight of their situation into their own hands, Lot's daughters caused the situation where their descendants would constantly be at odds with both Israel and Yahweh. So what we're seeing here is the purging the territory around the Dead Sea area at the hands of Yahshua is truly a fulfillment of the covenant that was made with Abraham and his descendants, that they would inherit the land of Eretz Israel, and that they also would be the ones to punish the Amori. So what about Avraham and Yitzhak? Having waited 100 years, Avraham finally received the promised heir, Yitzhak. But many years later, Yahweh asks for the life of Yitzhak back. As we read in Bereshit 22, 1 and 2, after these things, God tested Avraham. He said to him, Avraham, and he answered, Here I am. He said, Take your only son, the one you love, Yitzhak, go to the land of Moriah, and there you are to offer him as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you. As we know, the outcome was positive. The life of Yitzhak was spared, and the consequence of Abraham's unfailing trust in Yahweh meant that he was deemed as a righteous man before God. Then in verses 15 to 18, we are told the angel of Yahweh called on Abraham a second time. And this is the promise he gave him. I have sworn by myself, says Yahweh, that because you have done this, and because you haven't withheld your son, your only son, I will most certainly bless you, and I will most certainly increase your descendants, as many as the stars in the sky, or the grains on the grains of sand on the seashore. Your descendants will possess the cities of their enemies, and by your descendants all the nations of the earth will be blessed, because you obeyed my order. So we see the response from Yahweh was a complete confirmation that the trust Avraham had shown in offering Yitzhak meant that through his descendants, the nations of the world will be blessed. That is perhaps the most positive consequence to be found in the whole of Tanakh. So what about the Brit Hadashah? Finally, our readings this morning in Acts show another two important examples. The misguided actions which brought dire consequences within the Messianic community. The life of Hananiah and Sapphira was taken because of their lies that they presented to the emissaries. They'd sold the property and they'd passed the money over to the Messianic community. But they were contemptuous towards the Ruach HaKodesh because the money they paid, or the money they received, was more than they had given over. There was no problem in them not giving the full amount, but they lied about the price they had received. Therefore, their actions bore totally negative consequences, and they both lost their lives. Shaul, by contrast, being stopped on his murderous pursuit by the intervention of Yahshua, his outcome was a lifelong blessing, and it became a positive consequence because of his actions, or because of the actions of Yahshua and his response to that action. So in conclusion, we see there are many more examples of consequences that could be cited. But suffice to say that the choices in our Messianic walk which test our relationship with our Master, Yahshua, how are we going to react and respond to various challenges that determine our outcome? As we see each example considered, the person had to make a choice, and every choice has a consequence, whether it be negative or positive. Ultimately, every choice we make is our own. Shabbat Shalom.